well, the theme of this year's International Women's Day is Choose to Challenge. To discuss the status of females in fintech, we are joined by Cathy Lyall Lynda Coker, advisors at early stage venture capital firm Seedspace, and they are right here in the studio with us today. Cathy and Linda, welcome in.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Sam.
Now, start by giving us what your take is, Cathy, on current female participation in fintech. How are we doing?
So I think Australia is lagging the rest of the world to a degree, but if you look at some recent data and statistics out in the UK, for instance, funding-wise for women in fintech, 89% of funding goes to all male teams, 10% to mixed teams, only 1% to female, and I think the stats here in Australia are probably worse than that. So while there's some really great programs, some of which Linda's involved in, targeting females in fintech, it's really, really low. And I think until we fix the pipeline of where we're seeing people come from, and a lot of the pipeline is from the fintech, so financial services, until we really fix that pipeline, we're going to keep seeing this kind of imbalance, if you like, on gender in fintech.
So Linda, are you seeing the issue as there's not enough women coming up through financial services in general?
Yes, I think to Cathy's point, it's fin and tech, and neither sector is really well known for being diverse, right? So there's an issue on both sides when you combine them. So one, I think there's a population sizing issue. There isn't as many females in the industry, and I think that's across the board from founder to investor community to regulator to, but there is, don't get me wrong, there's some amazing females out there. I think we want to promote and encourage and build that gender parity in the population. And look, I think it's hard. I don't think there's a jurisdiction out there that has gender parity in the fintech population. And I agree with Cathy that funding is an issue. I think globally the stats were like 3% goes to female founders. But in Australia it's not as great. I think for a number of reasons. I think some of the settings are quite different. The incentives are not as good as other jurisdictions. But also I think there needs to be targeted government support to both founders, but also I want to see some more female investors. And I think once you balance out both sides, you might see some change.
Yeah, now I understand that you've been involved as an angel investor in Scale Investors, which focuses on investing in female founders. When we've talked with them before, the numbers seem to do the talking. Like the returns are there in terms of returns generated by female-led companies. We're just not seeing a fund flow despite that.
Yeah, and I think that's what I want to see change, and that was the whole purpose of setting up Scale Investors. I wasn't involved in the setup stage, but I since joined as an investor member, but I'm also on their board. And we wanted to direct more capital to not just female-led businesses, but also at the seed stage, that really critical stage where I think it's difficult to get funding no matter whether you're a male or female, but particularly if you're female. And I would also say it's about males championing change too, and we welcome male investors as members, and we have some very active male members that are, they want to support women also.
Cathy, one thing that we have discussed from time to time is that perhaps where strengths lie in terms of female founders and male founders, people have mentioned that perhaps male founders enjoy selling the business more. Do you think that sometimes female founders are left behind because they don't enjoy or invest the same amount of time in the sales piece as some of their male, competitors?
So it's an interesting question. I think my short answer is actually no, because most female founders I see are extraordinary. They've usually had to go through much more critical DD than male investors. I've sat around tables in Europe, here, in Asia, in the US, where I've seen various teams come through pitch events and the women will be asked very, very detailed questions around financials and numbers because it's almost like there's this latent perception around a table which tends to have less female investors around those tables than there are men, whereas the men are more asked about what's your strategy and your goals and international expansion. So there's definitely a different lens around female investors. I think a lot of the successful female investors we're seeing now are coming through the B2C space. It's never been easier to sort of get an app up and running, get some funding around that. It's the cheapest it's ever been. It's easier to promote yourself on socials, perhaps with B2C stuff, versus B2B. And I think B2B, which is a place I've worked in my whole life, I think it's a lot harder there for women to rise on the top. I think with areas like RegTech, for instance, we're seeing a lot more women coming through, because inside the large financial institutions, you'll often see very senior females in regulation, compliance, surveillance, in areas like that, for instance. And so they're naturally leaving these institutions and setting up their own businesses. And so I think RegTech's actually got some great diversity at that very senior level, but that's not playing out through in other areas of tech, in the fintech. And if we're not sitting in these, Scrum meetings, if we're not represented in the coding, for instance, in the code rooms and the repositories, then we're not being represented, full stop.
As an investor, how important is it for you to have a female founder to choose from as part of the selection process? How much is gender at the front of your mind when you're selecting a portfolio to invest in?
So I still sit on our Investco for our fund in London, and I'm an advisor here. I'm not in the Investco for seed space, but that lens is really, really part of who I am. So early days, if you can get culture right, if you can talk about diversity, if you can talk about the positives for growth and the P&L around that, and get teams bought into that early days, it makes a massive difference when you get to Series A and they're trying to raise, because they've ironed out a lot of the issues that we see founders facing in that very early stage, late seed stage, where they're perhaps just going after revenue and not really focusing on a lot of the other things that are going on inside the organisation, and it comes back to bite them later on. One of my fellow board colleagues for one of our startups, Jason Serter from Park Capital, talks about getting in the ZOOD. It's the zone of uncomfortable discussion, and we try and use the ZOOD a lot around the board, around startups, but I think it needs to extend beyond just the revenue and the P&L and things like that, and talk about stuff around culture, about gender, about diversity, full stop. Because to the point earlier, the facts are there. The ROI on female investors, they make the money back quicker and at greater multiples. The data's there now.
Yeah, definitely. Lydia, it feels like we have been having this conversation for a while, yet the numbers that you quoted are so low in terms of the fund flow into female-led startups. What kind of time frame should we be looking at when we're talking about this? Do you think we need to be led by either industry leaders or government by setting a clear agenda and targets when it comes to female representation and what we want to achieve in the sector?
Oh, look, I think it's all of the above. I think it's a difficult problem to solve, just like that, which is why we need to keep having the conversation. And I think it's... Look, I would love to see it accelerate, but I feel like it is all those different stakeholders that need to come on board. I mean, I think we need to see more targeted support from government. I really like Launch Vic and the Women's Sidecar Fund that they have recently launched, and I challenge the other states to do the same. But also, the investor community, industry, we need universities even, it's a number of levels, and sure, there'll be I'd love to see the next generation come through, and it's just generational, but actually I think there's so many things that also need to change, and I said it before, I think it can't be done in isolation. I think we need men to champion women, as well. We need their help to promote, support, educate. Women can't do it by themselves in these in these women-only huddles, and that's why, as I said with Scale, whilst our focus is on, and I should say female-led businesses, it doesn't have to be a female founder, as long as there's a female C-suite member, they have a diverse team. But why we have tried to have a male representation and male investors as well to promote and support. So I think it's a number of things. It's not just an Australian only issue, like this is it's difficult, and but I'm very confident that we will see change if we keep having the conversation. And look, do we need quotas? I think in some areas maybe we do. I'm not necessarily someone that agrees with setting quotas, but I think in terms of addressing that population imbalance to start with, maybe we do in some areas.
Well, when you're coming off such a low base, you can't help but having that conversation. When we talk about what the government could be doing to be driving this agenda as well, do you very firmly agree that it's something that should be led by the states, similar to what we've seen in Victoria, but hopefully more?
Well, I think it needs attention by federal and state. There are some very good federal initiatives, don't get me wrong, and there's a lot of funding boosting female founders and women in STEM and entrepreneurship, but I think there needs to be some coordination. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm very against this federal-state divide, you know, whose responsibility does it lie with? I think Australia's small. I mean, collectively, let's engage and collaborate and work together in terms of supporting women across the country.
Cathy, we've talked a lot about what needs to be solved, where we need to get from off a low base. Tell us about some of the success stories that you've worked. Who are some of the outstanding female founders that you have either worked alongside or invested in that are really pioneering in the fintech space? So
we've got some extraordinary female founders here in Australia. Some we've got in our portfolio at Seed Space. I look at Fairvine, for instance. We've also got Availability, which is in the wedding space actually, so it's a little bit different in the wedding space. But then if you look broader across the ecosystem, there's some extraordinary female founders across the board, whether it's Airwallex and many of the other very large unicorn type startups here. But to Linda's point before, it's not just about the founders, and one of the things, just riffing off what you were talking about before about the ecosystem, our ecosystem isn't well supported as a whole, whether it's by government, state or federal. And if you look overseas at Singapore, in Germany and in London, in the US, there's a very comprehensive structure of support that is everything from the money to education, to grants, to leadership from government and helping fintechs expand overseas. And we just don't have that joined up view yet, and that's something that we're really strongly advocating for. But I think right now in Australia, because it is a much more nascent ecosystem, we don't have this raft of B2C, B2B2C, B2B systems coming through. Being able to pick out and work with decent female founders is something that you actually have to work hard to do. I'm currently mentoring Bianca Hartke-Hazelman, who founded Financy, and she's published the Women's Economic Equality Index, and it came out today, this quarter, and sad to say, it's going to be 101 years before we reach economic equality gender-wise in Australia, and that's 1 year longer than it was a year ago because of COVID, and there's 6 kind of metrics that we measure there, and unpaid work is one of them that's really pushed us back. So it's good to sit down and talk about this stuff, but there's genuine things that need to do to support our fintech ecosystem that will allow women as entrepreneurs flexibility to do things from home, especially if they're raising children and still doing all the washing.
So just before we let you go, what do you think the fintech space is missing out on by not having enough female leaders? What do you think they bring to the table in your industry?
Aside from diversity, so the lens we bring is critical to how ecosystems evolve, right? And I think if we talked a bit about the coding repositories, and if we're not represented around the table, our view of the world, the way that we interact, the way that we expect services to be deployed isn't being reflected back. And I think a lot of that's happening already in finance, in banking, in how we even just manage our money. So I'm hoping that with more gender diversity, we're going to see people managing their money better, we're going to see better education, we're going to see more women bringing creativity to technology and technology to creativity. So it's only a win-win all around, and as I said, we get that ROI much quicker if you're in the fund space.
And Lydia, anything else to add?
So look, I don't think it's just fintech actually. I think it's across a lot of sectors. Women can bring a lot of things, and I'd love to see equal representation, and not just women, by the way. I think we need to be a bit more diverse across other parameters. But back to your ROI point, why is that? Why are there stats around the women that do get funding producing better results? And my view on that is that I think women can be quite disciplined, but also quite conservative in what they say they're going to do, which maybe is a factor in them not getting the funding. But if they say they're going to do it, then actually they will deliver that.
And more collaborative too, I think too.
We're networkers and connectors, and we like to help people.
Oh, look, thank you very much both for your take on female representation in the fintech industry in particular, and the steps that need to be taken sooner rather than later. Cathy and Lynda, thanks for coming in from Seed Space.
Thanks for giving us a voice, Sam.